Um, the the webinar series has already included 2 really thought-provoking sessions that we've had over the last month. One on work responsibilities and care commitments during COVID, and one on COVID and the impact on workplace inequalities. Today we're going to discuss the role of leaders during the COVID crisis. The webinar series is being run by the WIRC Inclusivity Research Centre at the University of Birmingham, and we've deliberately decided to open up these sessions beyond the centre membership and beyond academia, as we're aware that there's a lot of stakeholders that are particularly interested in these sort of topics right now. My name's Holly Burkett, and I am one of the co-directors, along with Professor Joanne Duberly of the Research Centre. The Centre undertakes interdisciplinary engaged research around issues of equality, diversity and inclusion in employment. We run lots of seminars like the one today, but we also run specialist workshops, and we also undertake commissioned research. So I'll now hand over to Scott, who's organised this, this special webinar series, who will introduce the topic and the wonderful speakers we've got for you today. Scott.
Thank you very much, Holly. And we didn't deliberately choose the warmest day of the year. But we will finish by 4:30 promptly, so that you can go and get on with other things in your life. We're super pleased with the people who are joining us today. We deliberately started this seminar series. We were working off the Democratizing Work initiative, which you may know about, which was started by a group of mainly French feminists in April time. And we were also working off an extended essay which Jacqueline Rose from Birkbeck, University of London, published in London Review of Books. It became clear to us as a group here in Birmingham that, that this pandemic, whatever its core effects, was going to be extremely important for work and the workplace. And we debated a little bit whether to deal with leadership, to be honest, but we're really pleased that we have, partly because of the people who have joined us today, and I think the things that they're going to say to us and the ways in which they're going to make us think. So Rosie Campbell, who's our first speaker, Professor Rosie Campbell, is a professor of politics at King's College London, who researches patterns of participation, especially gendered patterns of participation and voter expectation. She has worked with the Fawcett Society and the Electoral Commission, and her research has been funded by ESRC and Leverhulme. That's Rosie's day job. She's here partly today because she's the first, I think, director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's. So Rosie's going to speak to us for about 5 minutes. She's going to be followed by Christopher Pietroni, who's Professor of Leadership Practice here at Birmingham, and I think also the inaugural director of the Institute of Leadership here. And Chris researches leadership in complex systems, especially narrative and framing of leadership, with a particular focus on social movements. Dennis Tourish is Professor of Leadership and Organisational Studies at University of Sussex, and he's going to speak third. Dennis researches mainly, or has researched, belief in leadership, particularly charisma and the dark side of charismatic leadership. And he has a background in communication studies. He's the current editor of the journal Leadership, which has just published a fantastic special issue on the current pandemic. I don't know how you managed to get that done in 3 months, Dennis, but I'm sure you'll tell us a little bit about that. And Dennis is a very provocative and iconoclastic thinker and writer in leadership studies and management studies more generally. Then finally, we're joined by Dr. Suze Wilson, who's a senior lecturer at Massey University in New Zealand. And Suze researches grandiose expectations associated with leadership, which I think is a fantastic way to describe the research that you do. And Suze's work on the historical development of leadership discourses is also reshaping the field of leadership studies quite significantly at the moment. Suze is joining us in a recorded piece of film rather than stay up all night in New Zealand, but she's sort of with us in spirit today. Overall, we focused on the powerless or the less powerful, those working in less powerful positions, but today we're very much reorienting towards the centers of power And with that, I'm going to pass across to Rosie, who's going to kick us off. So over to you, Rosie.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Scott. As Scott's already said, I'm a political scientist and I direct the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London, which is an interdisciplinary institute. So that's why there's a political scientist at the helm, but there are we have organisational psychologists and sociologists, and so we're trying to work together, looking across a range of subjects, not just work, also politics and the media, and we're developing a global index of women's leadership. So we have 4 strands of our research together. So I'm a political scientist. I have never researched leadership myself, so I've got a lot to learn from the other speakers. But we obviously, as the Institute, are doing work collectively on some of these questions. During the pandemic, I have had so many media requests to talk about the political leadership and whether women lead differently, and I found myself drawing on a lot of the literature about women in business and senior women leaders to try and answer that question, because it's not something that in politics we've not been able to answer it very well, because there have been so few women leaders. So I think at the moment it's about 13% of political leaders globally, prime ministers and that ilk, are women, and that's obviously a historic high. So we haven't had the numbers to really do this kind of research except in a very qualitative, case-by-case way. And so we've been drawing a lot. I've been drawing a lot on this literature, but as I said, it's not my expertise. My view when asked this question about whether women leaders are leading differently in the COVID crisis has been one of drawing quite heavily on Thomas Chamorro-Premusac's work around the idea that actually it's leadership styles can be gendered. It's not about your gender. And I think in terms of the political world, it's such a perfect storm to have this pandemic when toxic hegemonic masculinity is so publicly available to view in a rather large number of countries. And so what we're seeing is a conflation of some men's deliberate adoption of a gender ideology, which has a very macho view of what a leader should do and what a leader looks like. And of course, they are very visible. Bolsonaro, Trump, very, very visible on the public stage. And then because there are fewer women leaders, Jacinda Ardern, Angela Merkel, they're subject to a lot of scrutiny and then juxtaposed against the men. And what we argue is it's the adoption of the particular kind of leadership styles that women may more often adopt a transformative, communicative, empathetic leadership style, but that isn't inevitable. And actually this kind of strongman leadership style that some of our global leaders have adopted is a deliberate choice in political strategy. So we are really interested in pursuing research on gendered leadership styles. And we've got a couple of projects ongoing that are perhaps not directly on topic, but are really relevant. We've just had an ESRC urgent grant to look at comparing the UK to a number of other countries and what they're doing in terms of the safety net for citizens during the COVID crisis and afterwards, and trying to see the gender impact of that safety net, both immediately and the longer term. And we want to see what's the impact on gender equality in countries that adopt different kinds of measures, but also growth and economic recovery. And as part of that research, we will also be looking at who the decision makers are and how they are making those decisions. So that's where leaders in business, actually, might draw in what kind of lobbying are they doing, what kind of case are they making, rather than looking at their business practice. Another piece of research we're doing is using natural language processing to look at representations of women in the media during the crisis. So I just got very distracted. I'm on my phone because we've got no power, and now I'm getting WhatsApp messages appearing. I was just saying, so we're doing natural language processing, and what we're looking at is when are women's voices heard in the debate, to what proportion, in what kind of proportions, and in what kind of fields. When are women put up as experts to speak about these subjects? When are they less present? And we're comparing Australia, the UK, and the US to kind of see if there are country differences. So I think that's most of our research that's related directly to leadership styles, and I'm really looking forward to learning very much more from you, the experts, about what you're doing.
Thank you very much, Rosie. That's a fantastic start, and good luck with those two projects. They both sound really, really interesting and important at the moment in particular. So thank you for kicking us off there. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Scott, and real pleasure to be with you all this afternoon and to follow Rosie. So much that we could explore just from that one input already. So as Scott said, I'm Professor of Leadership Practice at the University of Birmingham. I joined the university last October, and in that role, I'm also Director of the new Institute for Leadership at Birmingham, which exists in shadow form. We kind of soft launch this autumn, and then we formally launch a year later. So we've got a kind of a run in. So that's, but we're up and running and already doing an awful lot of activity. One of the things that we're trying to make distinctive about the work of the Birmingham Leadership Institute is, as Scott said, this focus on what we're calling leadership embracing complexity. And that's intended to nod at two things. One, we're really interested in what's the nature of the leadership required to make progress in genuinely complex environments. But it's also intended to be a bit of a dig at some of the prevalent notions of leadership, which seem to us to be more than a little simplistic. Scott's hinted at some of that already. So that's just at headline what we're about. I'm very happy to explore some of the themes around the Institute at greater depth if colleagues would be interested. But in terms of the conversation this afternoon, as Scott said, one of my areas of interest is narrative and narrative leadership, storytelling as a leadership practice. And in that work, when I'm in the sort of practitioner mode, what I'm doing is very often working with the public narrative framework, which is developed by Marshall Gantz at Harvard University. And over the course of the kind of pandemic period, really by luck more than anything else, we were already, I and colleagues were already due to be working with around 200 young public servants. Actually, they're participants, either participants or alumni of the Graduate Development Programme for Local Government in England and Wales. So they're mostly 20-something public servants, some of them already in substantive local government roles, others of them are on the programme and therefore in a series of 6-month placements. And as part of that, we've been working with them on developing their narrative leadership skills and capacities. And I thought what I might do this afternoon, really in a way as a counterpoint to, there's a lot we could say about the dominant narratives that have been at play, many of which have been beyond disturbing, enormously destructive. But I think that, it's fascinating and important territory, but I think it's been looked at. What was really interesting to me about working with these young public servants as they were developing some narrative skills and developing some narratives, I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by that in a minute, there were other stories emerging. There were other uses being made of the available narrative resources, which are a little more hopeful. And I just thought it would be worth raising those up as an indication of the variety of uses to which the narrative moment can be put. And I'm just going to show you an illustration from one of the public servants that we worked with, a woman called Hayley Sims, just as an illustration of what it is that I'm getting at and perhaps as a stimulus to thought. So when we were working with these public servants, as I said, we worked with this particular narrative framework called public narrative, which is designed as a framework for teaching people in public leadership in some way the skills of using storytelling as a leadership practice, as a skill to motivate others to join them in action. My apologies if my messages are pinging. I don't seem to be able to turn them off. It's coming through on the computer. And it has its roots in social movements. It has its roots in the civil rights movement in the US, but we've been working for many years now, taking that framework and seeing how it can be used and applied in other contexts, including healthcare, local government, and other bits of the public sector. And we've integrated it into the training program for for local government, which is how come we got to be doing these trainings. And in fact, I've just come from the first day of one of these trainings. So I've just been on a Zoom all day with, I think, 140 of these people running a training. So if I'm a little jaded, that might be why. The story that I'm going to share with you relates to the pandemic. And as I said, a number of the narratives that emerged from this work did, not surprisingly, relate to the pandemic experience. And what was striking about them, many of them, was that they were shot through with aspirations for a more inclusive future, and including more inclusive workplaces specifically. And they seem to demonstrate the ways in which the shared experience of the pandemic could, and the lockdown, could be transformed into these new narrative resources that I was referring to, based on creating different sorts of shared identities. And that those new shared identities can be used in turn to mobilize new sorts of collective action. So the illustration that I'm going to give, as I said, comes from Hayley. Hayley is an alumni of the program. So she's now been a substantive local government officer for, I think, 2 or 3 years. And as you listen to the narrative that she's created, you'll notice that she draws on personal and shared experience to weave a narrative that I think seeks to offer leadership for a more inclusive workplace and a more inclusive relationship between local government and the citizens it serves. And there was kind of 4 points in particular that I would just highlight. Firstly, I think Hayley's narrative demonstrates how shared lived experience of the pandemic can be used to create new expectations about inclusivity. And in her case, this has a specific policy kind of orientation towards mental health. But you'll notice, because this is a public narrative and not a policy statement, it's framed with very human qualities like vulnerability and kindness. And so we experience and learn from Hayley's story emotionally, that is to say narratively, rather than intellectually. The second thing I would just draw out is that in terms of narrative leadership, I think Hayley demonstrates how the minutiae of intimate daily experiences can be weaved to make stories that connect us to one another. So more than just connecting us to one another, they connect us to ideas about shared values, and you'll notice how she does that. Thirdly, in slightly more formal terms, I think Hayley demonstrates the opportunity for creating new narrative resources from the pandemic, and in her hands, they become the basis of some new identity groupings, a new, what we might think of as a new us. And Hayley's us is one that's learned something about how inclusivity around mental health can be achieved through a willingness to be vulnerable and a willingness to be kind. And having learned that, implicit in her story is that Hayley's us is now called to take action as a result of what it's learned, if they're to be true to those shared values which underpin the new shared identity. So it actually orients us to action in a new kind of a way. So finally, before I share the couple of minutes of Hayley's story, I just want to flag that, of course, there's much more that we could say about narratives and leadership narratives, particularly leadership narratives for people in positions of hierarchical power through the pandemic, many of which have been, as I say, disturbing and destructive, maybe even malign. And narrative leadership has within it that potential, undoubtedly. But I think what Hayley's story demonstrates, at the very least, is that shared experiences can also be used to craft alternative narratives that point in a very different direction. So
Chris, I'm just going to intervene here. So if you share this story, and then we'll go straight to Dennis. Would that be okay with you?
Yeah. So let me just share the story with you. So hopefully this should come through. Let me just share that, and here we go.
The situation we find ourselves in now is pretty much my worst nightmare. I've always been prone to anxiety and to feeling low, and after years spent dabbling in meditative practices, a long stint in therapy, and some serious soul searching with some help of medication, I finally got to a place where I thought I was in control, until a global pandemic happened. I've been through all of the different stages: grief, frustration, acceptance, and just a lot of hunger and snacking. And while I sometimes feel like I'm the only one feeling the entire weight of the world on my chest, we've all had our challenges in our own ways. We're not all in the same boat, but we're weathering the same storm. I've heard this said quite a lot now, but at first I just felt resentment towards the idea. I felt like I was in a little dinghy with plasters covering puncture holes to keep it all together, whilst my friends were having Prosecco parties on their yachts. But as time has gone on, we've started to see neighbours, colleagues, all the local characters that you used to see when you picked a package up from the post office after work, revealing more intimate human sides of themselves. There's something really powerful about seeing your director with piles of washing behind them when you're having a serious meeting. I've also noticed the dark circles under the other colleagues' eyes, and I heard a crack in someone's voice the other day as they told me their grandmother had died and they were worried about their mother who's living in another town. We've all seen it, and sometimes it's easier to just laugh it off or move on swiftly to avoid awkwardness. But what if we did something about it? In recent times, we've generally got better at talking about mental health, but never before have we been so confronted with the reality of each other's vulnerabilities. There's been real devastation in many cases. And so how are we still here and thriving when there's been so much hardship? It sounds simple, but just by being kind to each other. It's now become my default to tell people to take care instead of just saying goodbye. Neighbours who had previously never spoken are now regularly calling to check in on each other. I've been bowled over by the kindness I've experienced at work, from colleagues who have allowed me to take the space that I need to continue to be able to do my job. To be given the freedom to set my own hours and to log off if I need. I might feel contrary to the idea of being productive, but it was crucial for me to be able to continue to do my job and to be able to contribute to the organisation, which, as a public servant, in turn supports the community. In the same way that small acts of kindness enable individuals to thrive, now is the time to extend this approach in our relationship with citizens in the communities that we serve. As ever, throughout this crisis, local authorities have stepped up and provided incredible, compassionate support to the most vulnerable in communities, going above and beyond in providing emergency food supplies, business grants, council tax relief is just the beginning of this transformational journey. We've come a long way in recognising mental health as a factor in our lives, but for many it still feels woolly to talk about designing policies that nurture communities and prioritise well-being over economic growth and productivity. The good news is I'm surrounded by public servants in this room who all have real power in championing this cause and steering that change. I really can't wait to see where we end up.
And I will unshare my screen there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. And if you can thank Hayley on our behalf as well, that would be great.
She, of course, was happy for me to share with you today.
Yeah, no, we trust you completely to have negotiated that beforehand, but that was a very powerful way to finish your presentation. So thank you very much for doing that. And also for the content which led up to that point. Moving straight on, because Dennis, I know, generally has a lot to say about leadership studies, management studies, and anything else which you care to ask him. So as Holly has said, do please post questions and comments in the chat area on the side so that we can then call on you to sort of expand on or present your question to the speakers after they finish. So Dennis, over to you when you unmute your microphone.
Can you hear me now? Great. Well, thank you, Scott, for that introduction. Scott mentioned that we have just published a special issue of the journal Leadership on leadership in the coronavirus crisis. So I'd invite you all to have a look at it. Every article on it is freely available and can be downloaded without going through paywalls or anything of that kind. In the few minutes that I have, I want to just say a few things about leadership in business and what the challenges are that now loom on that front. This has been a public health crisis beyond any of our experiences. but it's also shaping up to be a crisis on many other fronts as well. It's now undeniable, I think, that a great recession lies ahead of us, one that will be worse than what happened after 2008, one that might be the worst in living memory, one that has the potential to lead to widespread social unrest, one that will certainly lead to a great deal of social devastation. And the furlough policies that have been in place in a number of different countries, I think, have postponed some of this, but they have not managed to avoid it. And we can already see some rumblings of wholesale closures and the like that now loom in the immediate future ahead. I think it raises fundamental questions about things like what is the purpose of business and what is the purpose of leadership, and maybe also what role, if any, can leadership theory play in leading us to better outcomes than what might lie ahead. So I think the elephant in the room often here is that, unfortunately for many businesses, the only real purpose that that business has is promoting shareholder value. We are in the 50th anniversary this year of Milton Friedman's famous dictum that the only purpose of business was to promote shareholder value, although he added within the law. And over the last 50 years, this has become embedded into business practice to such an extent that it's now changed. It's not really the promotion of shareholder value, it's the primary purpose. It is the promotion of shareholder value in the short term that has become the primary purpose of many businesses. And as we therefore face into how to deal with the economic reckoning from the tasering of the world economy that has taken place, key decisions will have to be made about who bears the costs of what lies ahead. And undoubtedly, hard choices have to be made. But I think for businesses that are totally animated by this idea of shareholder value, it will seem axiomatic that the way forward is to transfer the costs from capital to labour, to do it as quickly as possible and to do it as much as possible, which will have multiple consequences, none of them, in my view, remotely pleasant. First of all, we are already in a period of declining trust in leadership in general and business leaders in particular. Their reputation took a terrible hit at the time of the banking crisis. I remember a cartoon at the time on one of the newspapers of a business executive behind his desk, and his PA is saying to him, "Oh, and by the way, your mother called and she says you should be in jail," sort of indicative of the mood that was around at the time. These moods haven't gone away. They are not helped when people like Richard Branson seeks state aid, despite the fact that he is a billionaire. And they have helped to influence and fuel the drive to populist leadership, not least in the UK, and obviously very, very starkly in America, forms of populist leadership that don't actually offer any solutions, but lead us blindfolded and in reverse in search of new problems to accompany the old ones that we already have. And that in turn has its impact on the environment in which business takes place, because it adds to the problems. Therefore, a business cuts back even more. Therefore, that adds to the problems yet again, and that further fuels the panic that leads to the rise of populist leadership. And in the special issue of our journal, we have an article about this on India, where there has been a lot of it, and obviously one on the Trump phenomenon as well. So the background, from the point of view of business leadership, I think that this is all intensely problematic because, as the sociologist Alvin Gouldner reminded us back in the early 1960s, human behavior is very much driven by what he called the norm of reciprocity. That is, that human beings are motivated by the desire to reciprocate the behaviors that other people show to them. And this runs through social life, and it runs through political and organizational life to a large extent as well. Now, I think one of the dominant moods that people have at the moment is that business leadership has prioritized short-term shareholder value, that in the process, it hasn't paid much, if any, attention to the needs of employees and the wider society, and that the rise and growth of casual labor in terms of the gig economy has been one very unwelcome manifestation of this. If business does respond to this crisis by rushing, running, and embracing the idea of transferring the costs of it completely from capital to labour, then a number of things I think are likely to happen. One is that there will be a growth in people's feeling of what has been called relative deprivation, that they will feel hard done by in relation to the opportunities in life that they had expected, wanted, and feel that they deserve. There will also be a growth of a feeling of procedural injustice. That is, it's not fair. Why should I suffer yet again, having taken the heat for the great crisis of 2008 and still facing limited opportunities as a result of that? And as I say, if that is the response that people have to what lies ahead in terms of the economic carnage, which unfortunately I think we face, then we have that vicious circle that I just described, leading to yet more populist leadership, leading to yet more economic problems, and so on, unless and until other forces in some shape or form actually intervene. So therefore, I think that we have to rethink our theories of leadership and our theories also about what the role of the firm and organizations are in society. My own view is that most mainstream leadership theories, such as transformational leadership, authentic leadership, and so on, are completely hopeless as guides to action in this quest. They have always proceeded from an at least implicit standpoint that the role of leadership scholars and leadership research is to take for granted whatever the purpose of business is that individual business leaders declare, and then try and find a way to help them to deliver it. I don't think that was particularly sensible or wise as an approach. If it continues into the next period, that will just mean that leadership scholarship becomes even more irrelevant to the problems that we really face. So I think the challenge for business is one that's been there for a long time and that many people wiser than me have talked about, and that is to repurpose business beyond simply looking for short-term shareholder value interests, to try and build long-term relationships rather than short-term relationships, to set itself other goals and objectives and engage in widespread change. I think we also now have to face what leadership can bring to this issue of rebalancing the role of the state and the role of the private sector. We have seen, in my opinion, in the UK, and certainly in the US, where disaster in terms of COVID has quite clearly taken place, that if you belittle long enough the role of the state, if you deprive it of vital resources that private enterprise can never supply, then the symbiotic relationship between the two begins to break down and problems get much worse. This childish mantra that the public sector is always bad, and the words of Ronald Reagan that government isn't the solution to the problem, government is the problem, all of those ideas have taken a hit. And I think as leadership scholars and so on, we need to play a part in coming up with better and better alternatives and better theories of leadership, by the way, as well, that can guide us through crises such as this. I haven't noticed on my TV screen lots of leadership scholars being interviewed about the way forward, or for that matter, management scholars being interviewed about the way forward either. And that's probably a good thing because most of us have so little to say that might be of any help. So I will close my remarks by saying that it also therefore is incumbent on us as management researchers, as leadership researchers, to do more work that matters, to stop playing around with piddling variables that don't really amount to a hill of beans and that have such impact on society, and to more often address more serious problems than we do, more effectively than is normally the case. So I'll stop at that point.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Dennis. I've been struck by the relative lack of people from business schools on the news broadcasting that I've been watching as well. It's a curious thing, but clearly you presented recently in a series of journal papers and also in your recent book the potential ways through this and out of it as a professional community, which perhaps also speaks to Christopher's idea of hope. The final presentation, which Kelly is going to present to us now on film, is from Dr. Suze Wilson, who works at Massey University in New Zealand. And I'm just going to pass straight across to Kelly. This is a relatively short presentation, so bear with us for about another 5 minutes, and then we'll start to take questions to Rosie, Chris, and Dennis. Kelly, over to you, I hope.
Hi everyone, and greetings from New Zealand. My name's Suze Wilson. I'm a senior lecturer at the School of Management and Exec Development at Massey University. And thanks to Scott for the opportunity to talk to you briefly today. So what I'm going to talk about is my effort to provide some analysis of the leadership shown by the New Zealand government over the last few months in facing the pandemic, which I've attempted to frame into a pandemic leadership framework. In case you don't know, New Zealand has done quite well in relation to at least the first wave of the pandemic. We did have a curve looking like this. Our curve then looked like this, and it's been pretty flat with we had close to 20 days with no new cases. We've had 3 new cases this week, and those are the only cases we currently have in the country. So we are in a very lucky position compared to many other places. So in looking at the approach taken by New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and her government, what appeared to me was driving their approach essentially was a sense of trying to foster a shared purpose around minimising harm to lives and livelihoods, and that all of its efforts was really directed towards that purpose. And pretty much anything that wasn't contributing to that kind of got pushed aside. So an overall clear focus, I think, that we could argue is underpinned essentially by an ethic of care. The main leadership practices that the government has used is around its willingness to be led by expertise and follow scientific advice and act decisively in relation to that. A whole series of efforts to mobilise collective effort. As we all understand, everyone can make a difference to the spread or the limiting the spread of the virus, and so to try and mobilise that collective effort, the government has sought to provide information and advice to help people understand what kinds of practices they need to use to contribute to this, to pull no punches about the level of threat and danger this virus poses, and asking people to take on the difficult work of living in a pandemic. They've tried to provide clear direction about the government's approach, but also explaining why things matter and what the meaning of things are. So when we were placed into a lockdown imposed, at that point we had no deaths, we had only 102 cases, but we could see what had happened in Italy. The government said that in staying home we would save lives, and that was the meaning of the action, but also conveying empathy for the distress that the virus poses to all of us. Trying to unite people against the virus, that literally is the government's kind of key strapline, unite against COVID-19, and now we're in a phase of unite for the recovery. Addressing practical things that are the kinds of things that people do worry about as part of their daily lives. And when criticism and questions quite naturally emerge, as governments are making difficult decisions and imposing restrictions on our normal freedoms, they've generally sought to be quite non-defensive in their approach. The daily press briefings, for example, that were held during the period of lockdown were quite remarkable for their calm and the lack of combativeness between officials, politicians and the press gallery. And also a lot of efforts to solicit feedback. There's also a lot of effort gone into trying to help people cope. So to cope with planning, the government's provided an alert level framework to help make transparent its policy framework for imposing or easing restrictions, and given us timeframes when those decisions would be reviewed. Sought to build relevant knowledge and skills. The Prime Minister herself has interviewed some experts and made those interviews available. A lot of effort about helping people make sense of what's going on, so providing clear data, but also powerful metaphors. So, for example, under lockdown, the metaphor was that each household was a bubble, and we needed to ensure that the bubble of our household didn't interact with anyone else's bubble and burst that, because that would allow transmission to potentially occur between households. A focus on fostering kindness has been explicitly part of the government's messaging. When it was Easter, the Prime Minister kind of officially said, and it was in government notices in the newspaper, that the Easter Bunny was an essential worker, and to try and let kids know that chocolate would be arriving, and a whole range of creative responses from government, like sending out computers to families with no computers so their kids could be homeschooled, all sorts of things. All of that has helped build trust in leadership. There is good polling evidence to support that happens. And that matters because we want to be able to have trustworthy leaders, but it also matters because if we do trust our leaders, we're more likely to act in support of what it is they're trying to do. And mobilising collective effort is really foundational to try and mitigate the harm of the pandemic. So if you'd like to know more about my work, this is where you can find it. It is open access thanks to SAGE, and it did get published thanks to Dennis Tirish accepting it. So I hope that's helpful. Please stay safe. Please come and visit us when you can. I hope that there's some ideas here that you can take into your own context to try and make some kind of positive impact in coping with this terrible situation that we're all faced with.
Thank you very much, Kelly. The technology worked on all sides, which is continually amazing to me still. So that was Suze Wilson speaking to us from New Zealand. It feels a little bit to me like she was speaking to us from another planet, which is slightly better organised and better led than the one that we inhabit here in the UK. But I don't want to impose that on you as an interpretation. While we wait for a couple of questions to appear in the chat bar, it would be really good if you posted some questions or comments there. Otherwise, you're going to get me and Holly asking all of the questions about the things that we're interested in. I wanted to start off with all three of you, Rosie, Chris, and Dennis. There's been repeated mentions of the term society and also the use of the term collective. And it's perhaps not something we associate when we're thinking about leadership. So I wondered if you could comment on that and how you see the idea of society or the idea of some kind of collective, either in relation to the practice work that you're doing, or in relation to the research that you're setting up, or in relation to how you have approached leadership theory in the past.
Can I go first if nobody else wants to? Yeah, I think the point that you've raised, Scott, points to one of the fundamental difficulties with mainstream leadership theorizing and its usefulness or otherwise in this kind of crisis. It is often predicated on the assumption that an individual leader can and should articulate a collective interest, spell out some vision and strategy and tactic that is in the interests of all the people who belong to a particular organization, and that therefore everybody else should fall in behind it. That's been a weak model in business for a long time for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. It's also a weak model in some societies like the US, where populist leadership thrives on divisiveness, and where even within the UK in the past couple of weeks, we have seen signs of Johnson dying to embrace the idea of some kind of culture war that will mean that his sectional interests come to the fore. So if that's the case, it's difficult to see how leaders can articulate some kind of collective interest. I think Suze's points about New Zealand show that it can be done, but if it can be done there, it can be done elsewhere, but it requires a different model of leadership to what we have in India, the UK, in the United States, in Hungary, and in some other countries as well. And if it's to be done effectively in business, it requires a different model of the whole business process if it's to be remotely successful.
Can I just pick up from that, Scott? Because again, I think this is a really important point, and I'll just kind of restrict myself to the sort of narrative element of this. But the one of the things that struck me in Suze's presentation was the differences really with what I think of as what was the story of us that was told during the pandemic? Which is, what were the available narrative resources that were crafted into a sense of shared identity, which might enable collective action, shared endeavor. And what was interesting, one of the many things that was interesting in Susan's description of New Zealand to me was that seems to have been given serious thought, and that these actually qualities which were not dissimilar from what we heard from Hayley around kindness and care, there was something very human about that. And even this notion of the bubble and the household begins to frame this in qualities which are universal and human, aren't attributable to a particular nationality or perspective, but which can find their own expression within particular cultures and be given life. And I don't know enough about New Zealand, and it would be terribly easy to put New Zealand and Jacinda Ardern on a pedestal. I would, goodness knows, one's tempted to do that. So I don't want to make any assumptions here, but there does seem to have been a genuine difference. One of the things that's interesting to me about our experience narratively is that the NHS was, as is often the case in the UK, used as a source of shared identity. It's this kind of notion of, it's our closest thing to a national religion. And at one level, that's understandable, but the way that was framed was around protecting the NHS. So actually, the shared motivation was to a sort of an outside. It was an institution. It didn't have the same human qualities, the same qualities of kind of intimacy that we begin to see in the New Zealand example, in which Hayley was playing on. And I think that tells us something both. I think I agree with Dennis, it's to do with the nature of the leadership, which is deemed to be, which is offered and which is deemed to be acceptable. But it also, I think, indicates to us where we could go and where other ways of thinking about this might lie.
Can I jump in with a couple of thoughts?
Please.
I'm a bit wary about where we put different leadership styles in this pandemic on a continuum, because we are still, as the other speakers have all mentioned, really in quite early days in terms of outcomes. In terms of health outcomes, still early days, and in terms of economic outcomes, as Dennis said, we haven't even really started to see the impact. And so I think the point that you just made about not putting New Zealand on a pedestal, I do think we do need to be a little bit careful. And I think there are some real extremes in the styles that we've seen that are so clearly extremes that I think it is meaningful to say something about them. And I think when you go to the far end, to Trump and Bolsonaro, that are deliberately doing away with some of the basic rules of engagement with their citizenry and their population. So blatantly lying, blatantly saying, absolutely barefacedly saying one thing one day and another thing the next day, actively heating up the base as much as possible, activate the base in order to secure your short-term future. Compared to this riskier approach of Jacinda Ardern of actually saying, look, I don't know anything, I'm quite humble, not that I don't know anything, I don't know everything, I'm going to listen to expertise, I'm going to talk you through this process as I'm learning about it too. They're real extremes, and I think we should put the UK, we don't know where to put the UK in that at that moment. And I think the issue is that we've got a government that was set up for campaigning, and they were set up to polarize and to win, and they borrowed the tools from Trump. They were quite happy to lie in a barefaced way that had not been as common in the UK. But now that Boris Johnson's in government, I am not clear it's quite as simple as this sort of linkage with Trump. I think that he is struggling to find what his leadership style is, because actually they are using health experts in a way that Trump is really seriously trying to resist. Things like the narrative of the NHS is so central to British society. They can't, they'd probably quite like to try and undo that, but they can't, and then they find themselves using it. The issue of the fact that Boris Johnson's election depended on the votes of people in traditional Labour heartlands. All of these things, I think, mean that Johnson's behaviour, which is very vacillating, he's not being decisive in either the way Trump is or Jacinda Ardern is. I think we have to be very careful, and I think we'll be able to put this country in context in 3-4 years' time.
All very good points, well made from all three of you. Thank you. Dennis, very quickly, and then we'll move on to talk about trust and the public role of academics.
Yeah, okay, sorry, I forgot to unmute there. Somebody asked a question there in the sidebar about transformational leadership and why I said that I don't think it's been very helpful as a model in this pandemic. The reason is that transformational leadership theory is predicated on the idea that essentially the leader has enough wisdom at their disposal to be able to know what to do, and that in doing what needs to be done, they have the power and the right to transform the attitudes, the values, the emotions, and the behaviors of those who are, in a way, their followers. Now, in this pandemic, leaders haven't had that wisdom because it was so unique to us all. They haven't really known what to do. And the leader who has been very successful, Jacinda Ardern, came at it from a very different point of view of, I think as Rosie was pointing out, acknowledging that there was a great deal that she did not know, that this had to be a collective effort, that we had to rely upon expertise and so on. And anti-sloganizing was not going to actually cut the mustard. And there's a wider implication beyond that, I think, which is that we have to be wary of leadership theories that in their own way encourage this kind of strongman view of how society and organization should be run, that we must defer to the often entirely bogus expertise of whoever happens to find themselves in the top job at a particular point in time.
Super, thank you very much, Dennis, for addressing that, because I think it addresses a couple of the questions in the sidebar, but it also sort of takes us on to, I think, the idea of trust, which has been raised by a couple of people, and which Sue's also mentioned in her presentation. In thinking about trust and the maintenance of trust or the loss of trust during a crisis in particular, would you see there being any way for leaders to recuperate trust as and when it's lost?
Well, that's like asking how a person who has been guilty of infidelity can rebuild the trusting relationship with their other spouse. It's very easy to lose trust. It's very difficult to build it up again at the best of times. And I think for some people, the boat has sailed on this front in terms of trust, and will sail even further in the period ahead. We have escalating death tolls in the States, for example. Hard to see how that can be finessed as a way of building trust, especially when the leader of the country simply intends to fan division at every opportunity.
Just so I agree with that. I mean, I think one of the interesting questions in the UK context is why it was possible for a decision to be made that trust was not that important. So, you know, it's very apparent that you know, there was a seminal moment when trust was lost. I mean, trust was seeping away long before Dominic Cummings, but the decisions that could have been made, which would have, you know, somewhat dealt with that in a way that restored trust, were not made. Now that's interesting to me because it suggests that this notion of the shared, that it was at a premium to maintain a sense of shared endeavour for which trust is essential, was removed. And it would be interesting to explore that both as a sort of pragmatic policy choice. So, you know, was there something about the management of the pandemic that made that, you know, okay? But I think it also comes back to something Dennis said earlier, which is that I suspect it's also related to the fundamental assumptions about the nature of the leadership that's required. And, you know, as Rosie's been reminding us, you know, the ability to divide has become so significant in political terms that there is a willingness to trade away the trust of a substantial portion of the population because it's simply not required to enable you to achieve some of your outcomes. So I think for me, the interesting question is what makes it possible for us to not bother about trust in that way, in a way that was seemingly different elsewhere.
But I do think, or I hope, that it's a mistake because I think it's short term. So I think if you've mentioned Dominic Cummings, I mean, the man thinks he's a genius campaigner because he was willing to break the historic rules of the game and just focus on it. Only matters whether people vote yes or no in this referendum. It only matters if we win this election. But actually, when you're in government, trying to maintain that trust over a 5-year period, actually, as you've both described, it's an incremental thing that there's always a loss of political capital over an election cycle. And if you start at this point, it's going to be very, very hard to build that up. And I think that's because, I mean, forgive me for getting anecdotal, but I think Boris Johnson just thinks he can't do without Dominic Cummings, which is a huge mistake, because what he needs now isn't a campaigner. He needs people who know how actually to pull the levers of government and deliver policy outcomes for people. It's not going to be a yes, no on one day. It's going to be quite complicated, hard to deliver policies at the grassroots that he needs to do to achieve as a leader. And I just don't think that any of them have made the mental leap from just trying to win elections to trying to win elections in the longer term.
Super. Thank you very much for all three of those contributions. I'm conscious of time because we are trying to run to time, even though it's a virtual event, so we could run on, you know, right through the night, perhaps until Suze wakes up tomorrow morning and could join us. But I do want to sort of conclude there. We set up this third seminar in part to orient towards the issue of leadership as practice and leadership theory, but also to try to gain a sense of hope. And I think your comment, Rosie, in several contexts about this being a long process and we're right at the beginning, is perhaps not hopeful, but at the same time I think it is hopeful, because it is right at the beginning and we are talking about it and thinking about it and analysing it and collecting data. And I'm sure come September, most of us will be teaching about it as well in some form with 18 and 19-year-olds who are keen to think about it and to analyse it and to learn from it. So fingers crossed. The question that you've asked, Annette, there, where do we go from here? We continue with thinking and talking and analysing and teaching and trying best we can to do our jobs, including commenting in public when we possibly can, if invited by news journalists. Thank you very much to all three of our speakers. Holly's going to wrap up the seminar today for a couple of minutes, and I'm sure she's going to thank you again.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I would also say it's probably incumbent on us as well to be, some of us that are doing research in this area, to be as proactive as possible in trying to engage in those kind of dialogues publicly, rather than waiting to be asked, because quite often we're not asked, as we've seen. But anyway, generally in closing, I just wanted to extend huge thanks to all the excellent speakers from today, and to all of you that have engaged in this webinar, because I think it's been really stimulating, and will no doubt lead to further networks and collaborations offline and after this. I'd also like to send a huge thanks to Scott and Kelly for organising and running these webinars so professionally. And also, I just wanted to let everybody know that this is the last of these specialist COVID webinars that we plan to run. But the webinars have all been really successful in terms of getting people to speak and getting people involved, both from academia and policymakers and people in industry. So we'd really like to try and continue this seminar series and maybe move to monthly seminars for the WIRC Inclusivity Research Centre in a similar type of format, but with a broader topic looking at inclusivity and the future of work. They'll draw on the most up-to-date work from the Research Centre, as well as other groundbreaking research and practice that's taking place externally, like we saw today. And the next of those webinars will be at the end of July, so details will follow for all of you. And I'd just like to end by saying take care, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next month or at one of the future seminars. Thank you very much.
Almost there. Kelly, can you remove the last